다 가생 세수제바 주지바당 주니바당 주성바당 주이바 이보티게 단다 람 냠수 랑네 또바당 냠뇽 질라 제게 예베게 단다 드니데 베고네 템버른제바라 다 테레 테네 세수제바 정아바당 주루바당 주댕바당 접지바 예데 테네 단다 다티 빵자 빵웨게 고르당 테네 또자 또브게 단 니디 벨네 템버른제바 레라 다티게 단 니디 바긴돌라 템버른제바레.
Yesterday, we saw how verses 11, 12, 13, and 14 of our text explain why the proper practice of the path will lead to realization. Today, we're going to look at verses 15, 16, 17, and 18, which will explain both what is to be abandoned and what is to be realized by combining opposing and unopposing analogies.
Tene tateya tangpo te melongunung to zuni kharwa la zuni kharwa tabu yimbe cherna tene ta madape noma tamji la chakpa tang hienpa tang dembaran zimba te pangu pa dembaran zimba la tene tateya tangpo pe on to she na tene tanda melongun nang do tene kap lap ta perna sipa ta je ke te na tene rang zuni harne ta te jai do kan du hin ra je ke ta te la gawa ta zemo zewa la so pa se na ya tene te gawa ta zemo zewe ke yul ta bola rogi yo mare la ya Teu che te ne melong nung de te ne ta te la che hedang ra bo ji te ne che so te me de ta te de si ne che hedang nung ba ta bo ji te na ya te ne koran kap ka la ta sigre te na te ne hedang ji yo mare la ta ndor na melong nung de zuni kharwa chang gi re ma to la tene hienpa chewe ki yul tang dangwa chewe ki yul rabu kanya yo mare la tene pe te tabu la pe risapar.
The first of these four verses, verse 15, uses the analogy of a reflection in a mirror. And the purpose of the presentation of this analogy is to instruct us to abandon or relinquish fixation on impure appearances and on the reality of impure appearances. Now, according to the analogy, if a child looks, a small child, looks at his or her reflection in the mirror, they may think there is actually another child in there. And therefore, they become attached to the reflection, thinking of it as a potential friend or playmate. And yet, there is no friend or playmate there. It is a mere reflection, and therefore, not a fit object for attachment. If a monkey looks in a mirror, it may see the their reflection as another monkey, potential threat or competitor, and therefore it may bare its teeth and glare ferociously at its own reflection. And yet, because what it is seeing is merely its own reflection, it is not a fit object for aversion or aggression.
Tene tape te tardo demba pompe sem dena tatige sem je no ate ya namto harna ya ndra nyemon ba chona ya ndra la ngusu dembar trupata ngusu ngupuru trup depa kanya yo mare la ta te tabu ge sende ne tene medin pala mondo temperse ta chitang trup yo mare te ina ya tanda ngaran sum khor chambe kapsala tene hedan tabu che ji na ti hedan te la ngusu dembar trupanta boy tangus hedang ngo la ta kapsala kanya trupa yo marete hedang ngo la mati pe kasala tene medin pa ina ya tene hedang number rakwa nda bo ji ne tene ngaran so zeb ma to pata ba je ta tene te yenda la ya ka la yi medewa nda bo je ina ya tene yi medewa te ngone ngarang ge yi medewa te khang don do ya po ji ne te na te ngusu andana yebtung kado ka namba ndabota tene ngupu jeji namba kanya yo mare tombe namba la yo are te yena yo ti ngo la mati pe kapsula tene yi medewa te ngusu yepa che chor ni tene yi medewa te ngaran ne ni semba kyo ni tene medewa to dungan namba na chopa segi yo are la te tabu medemba mando temper sepa rete yena ya tene te ge jesu majupa te ge jesu mandongwa nye momba hedang ina yo nye momba hedang ge jesu mandongwa nye momba thakdo ina yo nye momba thakdo ge jesu mandongwa te jendo la senje number topa rakpa pen na jepa tabu je ina ya ndra chohe tabu je ina ya ndra yi medewa tabu je ina ya ndra te ge jesu ndrang ne yang na nye momba hedang la so be jesu ndrang ne tene ngaram pe rangwa me ba nye momba jesu jupa tabu yo mai ba yang na nye momba ta pe na jepa ta chohe la so ba tabu ge jesu ndrang ne ngaram ti ge ne ne tene pe san la dunghar chimbu ge ne ne tene yi medewa to dunghar wanda wo yo mai ba te ngo la te na te ngo te ranging ge madrupa yimbala madrupa yimbar ngo he madrupa yimbar ngo he pala te ne te nam ji ne pa menjong war se pe ge thap nda bo te te na
Just as the reflection in a mirror is not the actual presence of a legitimate object of attachment and aversion in the mirror, in the same way, what appears to and in the mind is not a legitimate object for either attachment or aversion. Whether we are speaking of the perception of appearances by the mind or the arising of kleshas within the mind, none of these things have any intrinsic reality. And yet, failing to understand this, we mistake them as real. For example, when anger arises in your mind, if you look at its nature, you see that it is unreal, that it has no true existence. If you do not look at the nature of the anger, however, it seems to be real and thereby overpowers you. When unhappiness arises in your mind, if you look at its nature, you see that it has no substantial characteristics. It has no color, shape, form, and so on. But if you do not look at its nature, you do not perceive or recognize its lack of reality, and therefore you are oppressed by it. So it is important not to follow or be caught by appearances within the mind. Because if we follow or are caught by our mental afflictions, such as anger, they will overpower us. And if we follow or are caught by unhappiness or regret, it will overpower us, oppress us with sadness. So therefore, in order to prevent these things from happening, when something arises in the mind, look at its nature.
Tene ta te tabu je yembe cherna ta ngaranso je melong nong tu zuni khawanda bu je ke tela dembar hin na tene te dembar hin ba ti tene ngarang la 제 요번으로 지 용기요라 대 칸디데세나 pen nye momba tenzo nye momba ki ji sun rang na tene ngara nye momba yopon ra boji se ne tene rang la rangwa me ba ji cha ge ba je da tene hi me de wa da dungal to cho he la so ba ta ba je yin na ya de ngo de rang yin ki ma tu pa de ye la rang yin ki ma tu pa yin ba la ma te na tene di ge yopon ra boji se ne tene ngara rang yin ki ne de dungal ta hi me de we 난로한다고지 용기요래라 다 대체다와 인도 모히니 드니 대이 왕도 마다와 있나 드니 디게 드니 넘도다 녀모바텐조 랑힌기 히와다 대완다고지 용야 임비처나 다 단다디 짠 빵자가 온드세디 주니게 베디 주니데 덴버마도 발라 덴버마도 바 히고바 임발라 녀모바텐조 녀모바이 알라 덴버마도 바 임바 히고 바제다 동할 또 조히라 소바나나 동할 또 조히가 랑힌도 마두바 히고게 야바테 히고게 야바제다 드니 대양 아란소 이게 고니 또제제 고니 임바 히바 짱마인바 무스 처제 침부그단 검니 생징오라 때때 랑힌게 마두바데 무스 통게 야바제다 무스 통니 데셀지 난도 바제 용게 야바테 단념니 난고 발라 템바 인사리
If we fixate on the reflections in the mirror as having true reality, we become enslaved by them. For example, if we are caught by or follow kleshas that arise within the mind, we become their slave. We have no freedom or control. If we are caught by or follow the sadness and unhappiness that arise in our mind, if we do not see its nature, we are enslaved by it and have no freedom. If you see the nature of kleshas and of mental states such as unhappiness and so forth, that nature is peace and bliss. Therefore, it is necessary to know the absence of true existence of kleshas and mental states such as unhappiness. And this must be known not by inference, but through direct observation.
Tene ta te jesala tsekse ba judu patrela tsekse ba judu pate ta tanda kondo saji ga kapsula huba yendo ta tanda tsekse ba jonga patin den tang namto la mahin par te pangja yin bala temba che dang tsekse ba judu pate tene chuni ga nelu ga ondo che ba che dang semni ga nelu de tene ngoso to guge yapacheta te toju yapache yimbatela te temarze parela tini te ya pego ne temarze parela pego ne tembe kapsula tini tati chuni ta semni ge nelu de ngo ye ne madup tomba ne yemba tomba ni yina yang tomba ni te sele la tene tini tomba ni de ngune gamju ya bacheta gamne te la tene rev top ju ya bacheta rev top ne ta ranking ke tene linji tu ju ya bachai re la tini te cherna ti ge ngus me pate ngus thongju me pate ge pete perna meto ktmala pe ga ya re la tene meto le ta chitang traman jung rela te korang on de siena ta pena meto te chimbo je ye na kangba je gna na meto ye na kangba yemba ti na to la ngus meto de manthon na ya meto gate de chorgi wa rela ta di meto gate de na ge chorgi wa re ma to me ge long don thong ya ge zuk kan ya yo ma re la zuk kan ya me pa ta ti ge meto gate ma ti gen kangba de chap to ba da bo 용기 요래 라 다티 용한테 페로 테네 Tene tanda ngaranzo ge chu tamchi ge nelu dan seni ge nelu to pa tela ya zuji nambala kanya yo mare toni ge nambala char ge yo re ta ngaranzo ge chu tamchi ge ngo chuni la tena yo toni ge nambala char ge yo re la ngaranzo ge ta chaja chimbu ge tan gambe kapsula menga la tene senji nelu gambe kapsula ya sente gamne mepala yepachi chegi yo arbisina ya mepala yepa chegi yo mare tene yepala mepar chegi yo arbisina yepala mepar chegi yo mare te wona khande de sena sen khorang no ate ranging ki tomba imba tela ranging ki tomba imba la ngo hi gu pa ta sem je ranging te tomba te ya bemdong nam khata ba ma imba tomba te tene mari pe tomba na bo ma imba tene te sacha Yeshe je namba ta tembe tomba je imba la tige salwa ta den yen da salwe ngo de tomba imba je ta tomba de yen da tomba ngo de salwa imba la hi ni tene tige nelu de to gu ge yore.
You changed it?
No, just it belongs in the footnote. It's taking the previous verse.
In verse 16? Ask about the tale of Kamarupa. Oh, all right. Yeah, sorry.
It should be in the footnote.
So it ends, the wheels of the mandalas will be known?
The fifth line, one with nature will know uninterrupted meditation, that belongs in the footnote.
Okay, but the actual last line of the verse is the wheels of the mandalas will be known. Should I announce that? Okay. So before I translate what Rinpoche said about this verse, on page 6, the top 5 lines in bold, the last of these, through the formless nature, will know uninterrupted meditation. That should be a footnote and not, it should be in the footnote, the second line of the footnote, rather than the 5th line. There is no 5th line of the verse. That should be at the bottom of the page after, likewise, those who enter the wheels of the mandalas. Is that clear? Okay. On the top of page 6, there is a 5-line verse or stanza. The last line of that, through the formless nature, will know uninterrupted meditation, should be removed from that part of the page and put on the bottom of the page with the bold footnote, so that the bold footnote on the bottom of the page is a 2-line footnote, the second line of which presently appears as the 5th line on the top. I'm not really good at saying this kind of thing, but I think you understand. So it's, like you copy and move and... Okay, now let's get back to this. The 15th verse instructed us not to be attached to appearances, kleshas, and mental states. The 16th verse points out, again by analogy, that we must recognize dharmata, and that dharmata, while having no substantial entity, nevertheless can be recognized. Now, dharmata, the nature of mind, has from the very beginning been emptiness, and therefore is without substantial entity or existence. Nevertheless, one can familiarize oneself with it, and it can be realized. If it is realized, the final fruition or result will be achieved. While it can be experienced and realized, however, it can't be seen by the senses because it has no substantial characteristics. Now, the analogy presented in this verse for this is the fragrance of flowers. If flowers are present in one room, their fragrance will spread to adjacent rooms. Nevertheless, if you are in the adjacent rooms, you will not see flowers because the flowers themselves are not visible. Nevertheless, the room in which you are situated is filled with the flower's fragrance. In the same way, dharmata, the nature of the mind, having no form and being empty, cannot be perceived or seen in the usual way. The nature of all things is emptiness. And in Mahamudra practice, we experience this emptiness or this nature through direct observation of the mind. But in observing this, there is nothing that is seen in the usual sense. Furthermore, in the practice of Mahamudra, we are not attempting to transform something that exists into something non-existent, nor to transform something non-existent into something that exists. This nature is the inherent or natural emptiness of all things, and in this context of the mind in particular. But this emptiness, which we observe in the mind, is not dead emptiness or nothingness, because it is at the same time lucidity or wisdom. While it is emptiness, it is also lucidity. And while it is lucidity, it is also empty. So this is the nature that must be known. And because of its lucidity, it can be experienced, although because of its emptiness, it has no substantial form or existence. It is this that must be known, and it is this nature that must be realized.
Tene ta te tabu ge semni ge nelu de to na tene ta te la ta ranging ge devanda ma impa tene kusum je nambala jingkhur jingkholo singge de la kusum je kholo la kharwa ta la hiparji sonre la tene te ya ta tangbo kusum de 간디 지하게 요레세나 아테네 셈니 지와메 봉오랑힌기 똥바레 ngoranhin기 똥바테 라테네 ngoranhin기 똥바테 라테네 빵자 젠지차 출바 아테네 데 빵기 요레라 디똥이 임발라테네 다티테 랑근 출바테나 출바탄 빵자탄 니엠몬바테나 랑힌기 마르바임비치나 랑힌기 돌와 ताबते तोनी लतेने चुमाजे ता तेने ताती तोनी दे तोपा लतेने तांदा कोंदु किबा यिंदो तोनी दे तोंजो माइंबा सालोय गोयिं बिचरना तेने सालोय गो दे ngand choryo kapsula kandeji yoresena तेने chuchiko ngand chege yorela chuchiko tig ngo de kandeji resena chen ze nu somje dani tanta pare tene tige chense chenba sedu tene tige chenbi yehi tige tene natural tan tomba on the sena chuni ge nelu chenge yore chu tomji ranging ge madu ba tomba ni de chenge yore de la jetawan chenbi yehi sung ge yore 다 산지 추주고 되게 졌다와 챔비 이히데 마도 되네 땅 알아서 출바 노아 샘진제 동할 샘진 남지 녀몽바 된소 챙게 말이 비세나 된 챙게 요래라 디 졌다와 인데 챔바티 대야 주인이 디 ngон도 출대 바임 비쳤나 된 챙게 요래 콩게 지주데 랑우네 돈이 지게 요래데 옌우네 세진 된소 출게 요래세나 출게 요래 출게 요래라 딘 출바 델라 출게 요바데 챙게 요래라 델라 진녀바 제비 희송게 요래 tini teya perna ngaranso mechi ni khuna tini tela mala mandawa harna tini tigel ti mala mandawa har ta tela ngehi jin je gitena ngehi jin tige tini 다 내출고 온듯이나 코란 테네 물론 마타와 코란 냐르시나라 냐리야 바테 챙게 요래라 Di nyalsi nang nyali yeba di chenpa tsamda yung mazi korang mulam ga nang la ren rabo tang, kangban rabo tang, teni che dewi ga tsorwa tang, dungal ki tsorwa kari nyang ga yeba deyang chengi yuwa re la. Di chengi yeba yendal wana tela korang la mulam tang rewe si na korang la ngenhi jing tela mulam tang maari. Ngenhi jing tela mulam tang king tela mulam tende ji tang do. Mulam tangwa tardo tanda kanya trup mendo gongwa di chengi re la. Te yendo sanji chu chi koi chang senjin tangjin korwa dungal le korwa dungal nyong do korwa namba na tsoba trul do truba tardo tanda trup yuwa maare rangu ne chu tangji tongni jewa mepe tanda toga yuwa re la yengu ne kunzon trup nungwa te chengi yuwa re la ta te la sanji chenbi yihi sungi yuwa re
Data de Tony, the more Tony topic, Dabji Pongja Pongwa Resons. Then is such a topic,
such a topic teni yihi
Yeshe de Chuku de Poya. Now, when the mind's nature is recognized, the result is the arising of what is called the wheel or mandala of the three kayas or three bodies. Now, the mind itself is unborn and empty. It is through the recognition of that emptiness of the mind in nature that all that is to be abandoned or relinquished is abandoned. And it is abandoned because one recognizes that all that is to be abandoned has no true existence. And therefore, through that recognition, it is freed or liberated of its own nature. But when the nature of mind is recognized, what is recognized is that it is not just emptiness, but is at the same time lucidity or wisdom. And through the recognition of the lucidity, one attains what is to be attained, which is the Dharmakaya. The qualities of the Dharmakaya can be enumerated as wisdom, loving kindness, and ability to protect. Now, the Dharmakaya in its wisdom knows the absolute truth. It sees the nature of all things just as it is, through having realized that nature. That knowledge or wisdom which knows the nature of all things is called the wisdom which knows how things are, or which knows the nature of things. But if you ask, does the Dharmakaya only know the absolute nature of things? Does it not know the manifestations, the variety, the appearances of things? The answer is, it does also know that. It knows the characteristics of all appearances, but it knows these to be bewilderment. Of itself, it sees itself dharmata, or emptiness. But it also sees or knows the bewilderment of beings. And this knowledge or wisdom, which knows the bewilderment of beings and therefore what beings experience, is called the wisdom which knows what there is, or which knows the variety of appearances of relative truth. An analogy for this is as follows. Imagine that one person is lying asleep in bed and dreaming. At their bedside is a second person who has excellent extrasensory perception or supercognition. Therefore, that second person who is awake is fully aware of the content of the dreams of the person who is asleep. Now, the person with extrasensory perception knows that the person who is asleep is just asleep in bed, but they nevertheless see the content of all of their dreams, the mountains and places and people they encounter and so forth. Now, the person with extrasensory perception is not having those dreams, but they are aware that the other person is having them, and they are aware that they are just dreams. In the same way, the Buddha does not experience bewilderment, but does see, in all its detail and variety, the bewilderment of beings.
Tene ta tige chenpa tsam maimba ta ten chenpa la tene tene ta tin chenpa ten ne lu dan tamba yung chenge yore la non sul kunzo ke tamba yung chenge yore ten chenpa la tene senjin tenzo tene senjin dunghal jin tenzo la tene toge niji chenpo rangyin ki chungi yapache tene niji chenpo rangyin ki chungni senjin dunghal jin namda senjin nyamomba jin namda senjin nekap nyamomba tang tenpa mayin pa tang dunghal tang tenpa mayin na yang de kap ka lam truba tang tenpa ta tenzo la pe tuk zewa chenpo ke yesu gomba te la tene chenpa tang chenpa pusung tsoba ta zewa pusung tsoba sungu yore la ta zewa pusung tsoba te la tene yang ta tin zewa ti ye ne senjin la zikbi kapso tene senjin tenzo ta dunghal nyongi yore la dunghal le jab mutu pandrabo tene pe tap dupo pandrabo mayin pa ta tige ta tap la tap number na tsoba la tene rimji jab tuki yepige tene ngo ta tempa zikpa te la nupa ponsum tsoba te ta sanji chamden de je tuk chuku ngo te la chen ze nu som je yen ten tempa je ta ngaran tsuge chu tam ji ne gamba la tene topa te ta tartu kinte bu chuku kollo te tobi yore.
The Dharmakaya not only possesses this excellent wisdom, which both knows absolute truth and relative truth, how things appear, but through possessing this excellent and consummate wisdom, it naturally possesses great compassion for all beings. Great compassion for all beings who are suffering, who undergo mental affliction, and even for beings who are temporarily not suffering or afflicted, but are still bewildered. So therefore, the Dharmakaya, the mind of a Buddha, possesses not only twofold wisdom, but also consummate loving kindness. Since it possesses that wisdom and that loving kindness, since while possessing that wisdom, it sees with compassion all beings, the Dharmakaya is not unable to protect beings. It is able to bring about the protection and benefit of beings through various methods. So therefore, in that way, the mind of the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, possesses the qualities of wisdom, loving kindness, and ability to protect, which are the result of the path.
Tene ta tela tene ta longkutong trukuni number ni te zuk chikoi number la yingi yore la tene te ya chuko te la chense nusum je dani te jota vajire la chense nusum je yenten te semchen ji njal tukrevisena njal tukyo mare la tene teacher na tuk chuku ge number le tene kunzo zuk chikoi number la yingi yore la tene kunzo zuk chikoi number la yingi undu te la te ya tene durja le takpa tamchi je ngola ta sala yupi songchu sempa chenpo tamchi je zingola longche zopu koi namba taba je le longche zopu koi namba la yinpa longche zopa se na chu de takpa song tupa tene ko te nyangin le mandawa la sopa tene longku namba la ngipa nga se ge yore ta ko nyangin le mandawa ton song tambi chu chung ko takpa jendung ko la sopa ge ngipa nga ta demba ji yung ge yore ti durja mara pe ge te ta jal tu ge yo mare la 대야 durja madapa tenzo la tu zivi torwa mayimba durja madapa la tene ta sanji jamdin de jitne te madapa nambala tene tene trubuko nambala tene tene zepa juni jigone ro tan zepa tabu ta te tabu kusum je kolola hartupati ta ngaranzu ne tan gambala tene yuntu yo.
From the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya, or considered together, the Rupakaya or form body, arise. The Dharmakaya, with its qualities of wisdom, loving kindness, and ability, is like the cause of these. But the Dharmakaya cannot be encountered by sentient beings. So therefore, it arises as the Rupakaya, or form body. For the benefit of those with purified karma, that is to say, bodhisattvas abiding on any of the 10 levels or bhumis, the Dharmakaya arises as the Sambhogakaya. And Sambhoga, or perfect enjoyment here, refers to the fact that the Sambhogakaya continually teaches Dharma without interruption, and never needs to pass into parinirvana. In that way, the Sambhogakaya is endowed with what are called 5 certainties. Now, those with unpure karma cannot encounter this Sambhogakaya, so for their benefit, the Dharmakaya arises as the Nirmanakaya, which is relatively impure, enters the world, performs the 12 deeds, and so forth. So in that way, these 3 bodies or 3 kayas arise as a result of having meditated on the nature.
Tene ta te jesla six pa chudin pa te la ta tanda chitang ta no tam chi senji no yin bala te senji no yin ta ngaran so ge no tam chi senji no yin ne ya tene je sa do re dra la so pa tene tanda hindur chakko tene chapu number tabajela hargi warela te kandisi har tugi yabate mahi patabo la tene per nangaranso shoja chembu ngira jansu ke tegnani na no sense ngote pase no sense tawaton no sem tomba se te nani tambo no sense ngote patabo ta ti se de ndana la sungi warela tene ta te la pego ne te pare tene tandi ge noa sa do re tra la so pa te ngo te rang sem la chargi yore sem la chargi yore te yin ya tene te retin zo pe chimbo ta tra tin zo pe chako 다 텐데 도 텐조 베 종부가 넘바 따버제라 통이 여바티 컨디진 통투그레 som나 된 통게 베데 되네 다 지당그 단다 착박 도 착박 라 베가 버려라 되네 롱장무게 쳐라 되네 쪽네 롱장모 디기 쳐데 베 장모 세나 당보 추잉어데 간디지레세나 냠보 다보지 요레데 이나요 롱장무게 뚝발라 떼네 롱장무게 주진라 떼네 드니 쳐데 착바레도 도낭긴 데질로 도투요레라 드니 당 아란수게 드가시서 못하나 쳐데 도낭긴 자는 로투고 마레 som그레데 이나야 롱장무게 뚝발라 떼네 드니 쳐데 도낭긴 로투고요레 대연돌라 나란속에 샘티 뜨무다 몽비 뚝발라 때네 다 당보 샘라 나란속에 샘레 샘텔라 농도라과제 제게요 namto rakpate pe hyokcher cher ndwala tene tene namto rakpate chirulji yurji nambala khar chirulji yurji nambala khar ne tene zuk mepa 당보 다센 넘버 토바지 마도 주요 말에데 이나요 넘도 망바티 제 좀도디 되는 힌트 사긴 트바 레다 트라라서 넘발라 샤르투요
The 17th verse is concerned with demonstrating that all appearances are the appearances of the mind. Now, while this is the case, we perceive appearances as very solid and substantial. Earth, stones, mountains, rocks, and so forth all seem very solid to us, and it is therefore quite hard for us to understand how these things could be merely the appearances of one's mind. In order to point this out, for example, in the ocean of definitive meaning, it is first indicated that appearances are mind, then that mind is emptiness, and so forth. And this is presented in some detail. The topic of this verse is that same point. While it is the case that earth and stone and mountains and rocks are in their nature one's own mind, in terms of how they appear as form, they seem vast, huge, and very solid. We might wonder, how can our mind contain, encompass, and perceive that which is so big and so apparently solid? The analogy presented here is the analogy of water and ice. Water, when it is not frozen, is a liquid, and therefore is not solid, does not have the characteristic of being unbending and hard like rock. But when a body of water is subjected to a very cold wind, it freezes and becomes ice. And ice is hard like stone. Now, ice is nothing other than the water itself. And normally we think water isn't hard. And yet, ice is water, and it is hard. In the same way, when your mind becomes disturbed by ignorance and kleshas, which are like that cold wind in the analogy, it produces coarse thoughts. And the gradual production of coarser and coarser thoughts, and therefore coarser and coarser mode of appearance, corresponds to the gradual freezing of the water. These coarse thoughts cause the so solid appearance of earth and stones and mountains and rocks, even though the thoughts themselves began as mere insubstantial thoughts.
Tene ta tanda tige no sem che namba impala tempa che ta tene che ba job ji ba de tene ta tanda shashin ge tige na ne sem tong ba hlun du mo te pa sin ki wa la tige namba la tempa re la tene te ya sem te tma me ba 다 샘데 단다 생지 내루데 ngoran yin 동바 임바 디네 ngoran yin 동바 데 뱀동마 임바 데이터브 롱인 라 랑힌제 요레 다데 생지 내루 데네 다데 스파 컨선 코르 젠지장 젠 다데 생진 그 동할동 생진 그 녀몬 바텐조 샤르게 요레라 샘게 텐도 당보 샤르게 요레 데 인나인 생지 내루데 데라 ngunig chen tang yo ar bisen sen ji ne lu de chen tang yo ma re tene ta te yendo la ta te tarba topan da bo je yena ta tarba top ge kapsula sen ji ne lu de tang bo du bo je yin ba la tene ya bo ji sar du zo ga ba re bisen sar du zo ba yo ma re la sen ji ne lu de tang bo ni ngo ji ba 당보니 넘버 타바 당보니 ngo tomba yimba re la tene senji nelu de per nangaranchu gamni tomba mahimba je la tomba zuiga ba yo mare salwa mahimba je la salwa zuiga ba yo mare sen korang ngo de tene te tabu yimba la te tabu korang la kari yoba de ngaranchu ge hi ba je la tene ngaranchu ge hi te ngus nyamsu nyon te ngus nyamsu nyon ne tene tige tanda tartu kndebote togi yore la junsin teacher na sepa konsang korwe janda hiwa nyangin debi yenti nika ga ta tela sem rangin ki number taba tela jujurun rabo kanya tangi yo mare.
In that way, the 17th verse is a generalized presentation of the fact that appearances are mind. Now, in Mahamudra instruction, after it has been explained that appearances are mind, it is often explained that mind is empty or emptiness, that emptiness is spontaneous presence, and that spontaneous presence is self-liberated. And this is what is explained in the 18th verse. While the mind is empty, it is not empty in the sense of being dead or nothing at all, because it has at the same time the characteristic of cognitive lucidity. Now, this nature of the mind, emptiness that is at the same time cognitive lucidity, has never been damaged or in itself in any way affected by all of the appearances and all of the bewilderment of the three realms of samsara. So therefore, one has to ask, is liberation from samsara actually the effecting of a change in the mind at all? It is not. From the very beginning, the mind has been empty and has been lucid. Therefore, in meditation, we are not trying to change what the mind is. We are not trying to make that which is not empty into something empty, or make that which is not lucid into something lucid. All we are doing in the practice of meditation is experiencing the mind as it is and as it always has been. When the mind is experienced and finally realized as it is, then that in itself is liberation. There is no need to change the mind's nature, because that nature of the mind has never been affected by all of the bewilderment of the three realms of samsara.
Tene ta tela ta teta buge semje nelu tela tanda jerdo tene kapkapla dewarhi binimbo sungi yorala dewarhi binimbo sedu ta chitang ke yongtamji ganane tezi buta rimbo da song yorete yina yung uni ge tanji on tsena tene sem korang nelu de tela tene sanjeji bichna dewarhi binimbo re dewarhi binimbo sinki te ya che sena che chuki thombo da boche la peche sena che ya thombo da boche to tha rimbo da boche la kogi yore de ngni sena chaite be tene ngaran nyamling ta darna be kal chembo la tene te ya dewa sedu ta ngaran so korwe dungal tam tal nyemo bat ne tene tingense cheparchi jilla chi na tene dungal ta tarwa imbichena dewa to parela dewa re hekpa sedu tene te Mumaga Kapsala, Sanji Mambo Chambare, Sanji the Chanju Simba Mambo Chambare. Tenzo Kandi Chini Chambare Sena, Dietabu Nelu de Tone, Tambo, Senjin Trunonji, Nyamomba Tan Demba, Dunghal Tan Demba Yimba La, Dunghal Ne, Pagal Ne, Tenikonambig, Nelu Chetawa Yindo Tote, Devi Satanan La Pepparella, Tini teacher na Konambagan Sena, Devari Hekpa, Sikuriore. Tini te Konamba Devari Hekpa Rella, Tangaranzo Tigini, Devalan Rogo. Devari Hekpa, Konamba Tinti Sacha Tinipa Peppare, Ta Peppa and Dabojel Tijana, Ta Tig Seni Genelu de Tone, Dunga Legalne, Devi Sal Peppare, Niamoba Legalne, Peppare. Naranzo ya tini te tabo ta ti jijil rogo yo ti jijil rogo ba imbe cherna ti jijil roto pe nubanda bo naranzo yore besena naranzo yore kare resena ta ti konambi ge senji nelu ton chuni ge nelu de zai ne konamba ya peparela naranzo la ya ti nelu de naranzo yore naranzo la naranzo le tadi la yomare naranzo konamba la yeba naranzo la meba je ina te naranzo galtu gi yomare te ina kon nambal kare yeba te naranzo la yore la kon nambe ge kare gomba te naranzo gomtu gi yore la teacher na devare ki be nimbo te senjin tamji ge senji je nimbo ndabo te saben ndabo te nuban ndabo te senjin tamji ge senji je la yu yeba la suare la te teacher na te tabu ge devare ki be nimbo la tar jila magana ni pe yo na renchin namkha choto yin ta dron yin nyemo me song yore nobu Rinpoche te la tani te si sada damda trakpanda bo te tom na yo nobu Rinpoche rang ngo te la tsanin jirwa yo mare teni namkha tabu je yin namkha tomba yin bichirna namkha tomba te timba kap ne teni namkha tomba te tonya me ba ji chog yore te yin yo namkha khorang na timbi go yore besena ta kanya goyo mar namkha tongba de tongbarang la ne yo pe te yendo la pe sumba te chonda boji yena chote tangba yo ta tina thala da ji tab na chote te si nyoma so gre de yena yo chorang ngo de tangba rang yo re thala khorang khorang re ma to chog rang hin de thala ndrog ma re te yendo la ngaranso senji ne lu ta boji yena ya tanda kapkasala teni nyemo bata namto ta dungal ta jepala so be dribgi yore de yinaya te ten tambala senjinel khorama jurwa tang yore besine jurwa tang yo mare te yinaya ta tanda kapdna la pe ga du ndom do chu na choga Rinpoche we ji te we chung sarwa mai no sundu tene ndom ga na no bu de che na ne ka di we rabote ta nuban rabote ta yendin rabote tong tu yo mare te salna te inji min di sal go reso
Sikche rang de rinchen namka de chudak shen
ta dorong yin ye mo me
tak to rang jen yamame.
te jilam
Ora. Damla chuk na noba Rinpoche. Sik sumbate. Oh, dire be. Oh yeah.
dam tu chu na chu garum ba chi te ye sa
Often, the nature of the mind is called Buddha nature or Sugata Garbha, which means the essence of those gone to bliss. Now, when the term Sugata Garbha is used, as it often is in textual traditions, because it is so exalted a term, even though it refers to the nature of our own minds, it sounds very distant from us and very far off and unapproachable. It's therefore important to understand what this term Sugata Garbha really means. Sugata means those gone to bliss. So Su here means bliss. Bliss means if you recognize and realize the nature of your mind, you transcend and eliminate the sufferings of samsara. Therefore, the result of realizing the mind's nature is bliss. Gata or gone means that innumerable Buddhas have appeared, and all of them have achieved awakening through realizing the nature of their minds and thereby attaining the bliss of Buddhahood. All of them began as bewildered sentient beings. They transcended the bewilderment and suffering of samsara and achieved or went to a bliss. Now, we want to and we need to follow them. We want to realize the nature of our minds and go to bliss. The question arises, do we have the ability to do so? The answer is yes. We have the innate or inherent ability or capacity to follow and emulate those who have gone to bliss, those Buddhas. Now, if we lacked their makeup, if we lacked what they had and what they have, then we might not be able to do it. But we have in our nature everything that they ever had and have. Therefore, since we have what they have and they did it, therefore we can do it. So that is why the nature of the mind is called the nature or essence of those gone to bliss. About this, in the Uttara Tantra Shastra, it says, like a jewel, like space, and like pure water, it is continually free of affliction. Now, when a jewel is purified, that is to say, when what surrounds it is removed, the nature of the jewel itself does not change. The jewel was always jewel in its nature or composition. When clouds disappear from the sky, the space of the sky does not undergo any change, and the space was not inherently affected or polluted in its nature by the presence of the clouds. Water is in and of itself just water, pure water. It only becomes polluted when sediment is introduced into it or mixed with it. But even so, the water itself remains just water. It is combined with something, but not in itself affected by or changed or damaged by the presence of the sediment. In the same way, while our minds are afflicted and obscured by ignorance and kleshas and thoughts, the nature of the mind, our minds in and of themselves, are not afflicted or affected by the presence of these things. Nevertheless, while these things are present, then the qualities of the mind's nature will not be evident. So therefore it says in the verse, if a supreme gem is placed in a swampy mire, its radiance, however, will not be clear.
Tige tsexjeba jobjiba de hubarela tring tezam hyona kasing ta le tangboba kahela hinege kor desi hubarela tige troni desi hyona tanda kasing kapsula tene sem mazimba simbarsi bigta de hubarela tene de ya tanda 남도 차라 된서디 지마 희규니 샘데 점부르 야반다보제라 다 디기탑 된수 휴바레라 다 드링게 갑슬라 다 콘남발라 펜비기 쳇돌라 심바 템버시비 맹어 데 휴나 송송마 덴티 심바 템버시비 맹어 라 지당 망부 요레디 이나야 디게 나니 조다부데라 센네비 탑고 송요레라 센네베 탑고이 당보디 다 njokpa sungi yorela. Tene njokpa sedu ta kondo kasin hyupa yendo chora to balap ransar he yomi semji cho ngangi ne senkinte ta namto chawa tang rakpa te la tempa tang hihingi yakpo je chong ne tene namto chora tenzo hibo tene song ne semte ranghingi namto mebe salve ngondo tembor nepache la ta ti hine segi yorela ti ngondo te si nyambar ya ta te la njokpa si te si chongne njokpa si ta ngaranz le tangbo pa yinpe cherna jen rinpo chong tuku yo mare ni ti cherna ti ngondo te si namto machi pa si yen tung tung che la njok nyambar ya sal singe rabo semti salve ngondo hewe ngondo nyambar ya te la njokpa segi yorela 다 된 조파티 테시 레라와레 테닌 조파티라 칸데 고기 요레세나 조파티 짱짱 감드기 요 마레라 다 테테시 제인스 쫑게 쳇들 칸데 요 고기 요레세나 전든 조파 세두 테시 후말리 예인ren도 동 단다 당부 예인 퉁퉁 요 티 야포 살보 더보지 정소나 테테시 제인쫑 티티 젠종네 다 세컨 제인 더보지 나 당보 티니 티 세컨 이 더보지 티니 세컨 이 더보지 세컨 솜 더보지 제네 데라 전든 족바
I'm going to stop with the principal instruction here with the explanation of the 18th verse. Yesterday I began to introduce the practice of shine, or tranquility meditation, for the benefit of beginning students, and I'm going to continue with that explanation today. Yesterday I presented the methods for getting a hold of the mind when it has not been gotten a hold of, and through the practice of those methods one becomes able to enable the pacification of coarse and subtle thoughts, and one begins to be able to rest one's mind. So for the benefit of beginning practitioners, today I'm going to explain the second stage or second aspect of tranquility instruction, which is called stabilizing the mind once it has been grasped or once it has been gotten a hold of. Now, this category can include many different instructions and methods, but those of principal importance among them are what are called the 9 methods of resting the mind. The first of these 9 is placement or rest. Now, placement or rest refers to what was described in the quotation I gave yesterday from the third Jawon Karmapa, the waves of coarse and subtle thoughts being pacified in their own place. May the river of mind rest without distraction or unmoving in its nature. When one practices placement, one rests the mind free of thought in its own natural or inherent clarity. So placement or rest consists of remaining or resting briefly in a state of lucid tranquility. And because one develops this as a beginner, this state of rest or placement may be very, very brief. Now this is somewhat or comparatively easy to accomplish, but it is also not enough. One has to go further. Therefore, the second method of resting the mind is called continued or prolonged placement. And continued or prolonged placement means simply to gain the ability to slightly prolong the periods of rest or placement of the mind. For example, if in the beginning one could rest the mind in lucid tranquility for 1 second, one prolongs it until one can do so for 2 seconds, and finally 3 seconds, and so forth.
Tene ta tela jondun jopa se te ci rendo tamarela ta tela jondun jopa se nyamlin se pe capsula ta kande jungre se na te se capjela yengre ta ngara gong gten ne pate jopa rela jopa ta jondun jopa rela ta tela ne matupa tene nomto yendo je truone gong gten do mane pa yungre la 다티 강그텐도 많이 바티캅라 가리고 그래서나 되네 탑숨바텔라 샘네 탑숨바텔라 되네 다티 카시기나는 니어른조 섬조래라 티 카시기나는 렌딘조 바섬조래라 다티 세테 렌딘조 바생긴데 데지 고대완다 보지 용기와래라 되네 대야 다단다 남도 된초와데 추바 잔장거 온 땅마야바 다 코나 디지에스 조마야바지네 당보 남도데 예인송한테 뭐히바세 남도데 예인송한테 뭐히바세네 뭐히베갑라 다데 다 지당거 되네 견동연된 가야 마인바 배는 제 말에 나랑서 샘지 내당한테 요아래라 디처나 제 가야 말에 대전들라 연대야 말에 대가리리세나 다 검나 덤비게 연대지 말에라 디처나 코란타가시 야니 샘디 쪼르레네 되니 단다 누마가 검그텐도 쪼르 야니 냠버리가 바텔라 숨바 렌데 조바 숨게
While practicing placement and prolonged placement, still, from time to time, one finds oneself becoming distracted. And in this case, distraction means when the arising of a thought or a series of thoughts prevent you from bringing your mind to rest. Therefore, in order to deal with this situation, you need the third method of resting the mind, which is usually referred to or can be referred to by two terms. One is close placement, and the other one is returning placement. Of the two, returning placement is more descriptive, so that's the one that I will use. And it means pretty much what it sounds like. When you become distracted by the arising of a thought or thoughts, rather than allowing your mind just to go with or be caught by the distraction, as soon as you recognize that you have become distracted, you return to the resting of the mind. You return to placement. Now, this does not mean regarding the occurrence of distraction as either good or bad. It is unnecessary to regard it as bad, as a problem, because it is part of the process of training in meditation, and therefore should not be regarded or need not be regarded as a particular problem or defect. But it should also not be regarded as a quality, because distraction does prevent one's progressing in the practice of meditation. So therefore, in that way, having recognized distraction, rather than judging it as one thing or another, one simply returns to the placement of the mind, and that is what is called returning placement.
Tene ta tige taindo ta sannepe tab yibatela nyewaranjo somyorela ta tige tangbo namto deje tro de le churdo de dingen zenje gong de nyampriya dingen zenje gong de nyampriya ne ta kare go gresina te ya te si jenjong ne ngoma tar dun seni cha cha ta den be go ne temba ta hi hin ta den be go ne nyambrin jo patela teni ti ge naming ge on de tang ma ya pa ti si ten hi gi jong ne ya patela ni warin jo pa sung bi wa la ta te tar do gamba te sen ne pe ta bi wa 다 디다인도 드네 가래강국이 와르세나 다 단다 갑갑라 드네 샘테라 드네 강나 데지 마토 완다 보다 드네 갑갑라 데지 칼레칸다 보다 Tene kapkala tene namto on the katu yina ya shordo anda bota tende yungu yo ada la ta tela tende che gambe kapsula ta te le tambo bi tambo njopa jontun njopa lendin njopa nyoren njopa ta ti daindo ta te rama mando anda bo chungu na kari se ko se na tulwar se pasungu yo ara la ngaba te tulwar se pasungu yo ara la tulwar se pa te se ngaranso chen kari yung se na te se gong sumba na hi madewa na hi chung kapsula tene gong yen ten ten so ten ni te gom japa jabju yapa te pe kalwa sang po yimba gom jabju yapa te gupa chempo yapa tene gom te pe menga sapo yimba tene ta hini na yung rong long tong yin na yung gom te pe kal chempo yimba tene te pento chempo yimba te yen ten ten so som na tene sem te ngar da manda wak te chua da bo che yung yo are la chua da bo te yung na gom te te tulwa jombo da bo che madulwa te tulwa se pa imbe cherna tene tanda ngaba te tulwa se pa
Shiba de la nyawar jopa sungdo.
nyewarin jopa song to
So the fourth method of resting the mind is here called close placement. And close placement means that after having applied the third, in other words, after having recognized distraction and simply returned to a state of placement, one continues to rest the mind through the continued application of mindfulness and alertness. But in addition to these four, sometimes one will experience that one's mind is simply unwilling to do it. This can be because one is tired or for other reasons unenthusiastic about the practice of meditation, or through lacking energy in the practice, one may simply be overpowered by the appearance of thoughts. So at this point, in addition to the beginner's practice of placement, prolonged placement, returning placement, and close placement, you need a fifth method or technique, which is called taming. Now, taming here means the recollection of the qualities and benefits of meditation. When you are tired and unenthusiastic, and therefore your mind is temporarily unable to meditate properly, by recollecting the reasons why you are practicing, the benefits and importance of practice, whether it is tranquility or insight, the usefulness and value of meditation practice, you will generate enthusiasm. The enthusiasm itself will tame or subdue your mind and give it the energy to return to the practice of placement.
tene dringado de sangsena ta tenzo le tampo pa tenzo te nyam ni naro na yogi ma tene ngwa to ngi.
I'm going to stop for this morning with the instruction to beginning students to try to practice all of this, and then we'll recite the dedication and aspiration.
Yeah.